Chapter 10 of The Power of Israel in the United States by James Petras. The Caricatures in Middle East Politics. The centerpiece of the explosive confrontation between Islamic and Arab protesters, political leaders and governments, and the US and Western European regimes and publishers over caricatures published in Denmark is rooted in Israeli efforts to polarize the world in its favor and to promote isolation, economic sanctions, and/or a military attack on Iran. There are several key questions which almost all commentators and analysts have failed to address. These include: why did the cartoons get published in Denmark? What is the political background of Flemming Rose, the cultural editor of Jyllands-Posten, who solicited, selected, and published the cartoons? What larger issues coincide with the timing of the cartoons' publication and reproduction? Who benefits from the publication of the cartoons and the ensuing confrontation between the Arabs, Islam, and the West? What is the contemporary political context of the Arab-Islamic protests? How is the Israeli Secret Service, Mossad, implicated in provoking the Western Islamic-Arab conflict, and how do the consequences measure up to their expectations? A starting point for analyzing the cartoon controversy, which has been a focus for attacking Muslims and Muslim countries as intolerant of Western freedom of expression, is the long-standing role of Denmark as a major operation point for Mossad activity in Europe. Rephrased, how could a tiny Scandinavian country of 5.4 million citizens and residents, 200,000 or less than 3% of whom are Muslim, renowned for fairy tales, ham and cheese, have become a target for the fury of millions of practicing Muslims from Afghanistan to Palestine, from Indonesia to Libya, pouring into the streets of cities all over the world with significant Muslim populations? Why, after the bombing of Baghdad, the tortures of Abu Ghraib, the massacres in Fallujah, and the utter destruction of the entire Iraqi and Afghan people, would Muslims turn their anger at symbols of Denmark, from its tinned cookies to its embassies and overseas business offices? The story, presented with straight faces by television news people, is of Mr. Flemming Rose, a crusading cultural editor of a widely read Danish daily newspaper who wanted to counter the growing political correctness of Europeans about criticizing Muslims, which he compared to the self-censorship he had witnessed in his native Soviet Union. The oddly named Ukrainian-born editor of the culture page of the Jyllands-Posten commissioned Danish cartoonists to submit a series of cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad as they, the Danish cartoonists, might imagine him. However, 4 of the 12 cartoons selected for publication were illustrated by Rose's own staff, including the most controversial Bomb in the Turban one. Braving Denmark's anti-blasphemy laws, Mr. Rose published the cartoons on September 30, 2005, and the rest is history. A huge worldwide attack on what was portrayed as the West's sacred right to free expression erupted in the Muslim world, with millions of shocked Europeans and North Americans rushing to defend their cherished freedoms in this clash of civilizations. Syria and Iran were prominently blamed for the stirring up of furious believers in the streets of Damascus and Tehran, and in Beirut and the slums of Gaza. According to U.S. Secretary Rice, Iran and Syria have gone out of their way to inflame sentiments and to use this to their own purposes, and the world ought to call them on it. The Pakistani and Libyan authorities, allied to the U.S., fired on demonstrators, killing and wounding scores, while numerous religious leaders were arrested. The Western governments urged their Arab and Muslim allies to prevent more attacks on Danish products and property, and blamed those unable to quell the fury with complicity and instigation. All of this was over a series of cartoons, or so we are told. The cultural editor, Flemming Rose, who soon tired of being surrounded by a team of Danish police and security to protect him from assassination, and missing his daily jogs through his tranquil Copenhagen neighborhood, chose to seek safe haven in Miami, Florida, rather than his native Ukraine, among the Cuban exiles, Israeli Zionim, and mahjong-playing retirees as the drama played on. Denmark, center of Mossad activity. Why Denmark? Could this crudely manufactured controversy have been generated on the pages of any major London or New York paper? Who would wish to put Denmark at the center of this clash of civilization, appearing as a script from some B-grade Islamophobic thriller? An interesting chapter in former Israeli Mossad agent Victor J. Ostrovsky's book, By Way of Deception, outlines the close relationship between the workings of the Danish intelligence services and the Israeli Mossad over decades. Excerpt. The relationship between the Mossad and Danish intelligence is so intimate as to be indecent, but it is not the Mossad's virtue that is compromised by the arrangement, it's Denmark's. And that's because the Danish are under the mistaken impression that because they saved a lot of Jews in World War II, the Israelis are grateful and they can trust the Mossad. The Mossad has the capacity to monitor the entire population of Arabs, and especially Palestinians, presumably including those with Danish citizenship, in Denmark through their special relations with the Danes. Excerpt. A Mossad man monitors all Arabic and Palestinian-related messages among Denmark's Arab community coming into the Danish Civil Security Service headquarters, an extraordinary arrangement for a foreign intelligence service. The Danish intelligence officers' high regard for their Israeli Mossad office mates is apparently not, according to Ostrovsky, reciprocated. Excerpt. The Mossad have such contempt for their Danish counterparts that they refer to them as "furtsalak," the Hebrew term for a small burst of gas, a fart. They tell the Mossad everything they do. In return for their servility, the Danes get valuable, quote, training from the Israelis. Once every 3 years, Danish intelligence officials go to Israel for a seminar conducted by the Mossad, which generates useful contacts for the Mossad, while perpetuating the notion that no organization deals with terrorism better than they, the Mossad, do. In the wake of the U.S. debacle in Iraq and the world's resistance to a massive preemptive military attack or economic and diplomatic embargo of Iran, which could send oil prices to over $100 a barrel, Israel needed to turn the war of ideas on its head. It would make sense that a propaganda campaign aimed to further whip up justifications to attack countries like Iran and Syria, at the time of the cartoon's publication, Israel's current enemy du jour, should emanate from one of the U.S.'s strongest European allies in the invasion and destruction of Iraq and Afghanistan, one whose national intelligence apparatus, so fondly known as Furtsalak, would be eager to serve Israel's interests. Fleming or Flaming Rose, journalist with a cause. Given Mossad's long-standing penetration of the Danish intelligence agencies and its close working relations with the right-wing media, it is not surprising that a Ukrainian Jew, operating under the name of Fleming Rose, with close working relations with the Israeli state and, in particular, the far-right Likud regime, should be the center of the controversy over the cartoons. Rose's ties to the Israeli state antedate his well-known promotional interview with Daniel Pipes, 2004, the notorious Arab-hating Zionist ideologue. Prior to being placed as a cultural editor of a leading right-wing Danish daily from 1990 to 1995, Rose was a Moscow-based reporter who translated into Danish a self-serving autobiography by Boris Yeltsin, godchild of the pro-Israeli post-communist Russian oligarchs, most of whom held dual Russian-Israeli citizenship and collaborated with the Mossad in laundering illicit billions. Between 1996 and 1999, Rose, the journalist working the Washington circuit, traveling with Clinton to China before returning to Moscow 1999 to 2004 as a reporter for Yellen's Posten. In 2005, he became its cultural editor despite little or no knowledge of the field and over the heads of other Danish journalists on the staff. In his new position, Rose found a powerful platform to incite and play on the growing hostility of conservative Danes to immigrants from the Middle East, particularly practicing Muslims. Using the format of an interview, he published Pipes' virulent anti-Islamic diatribe, probably to test the waters before proceeding to the next stage in the Mossad strategy to polarize a West-East confrontation. provoking conflict between Muslims and the West. While the Zionists succeeded in their goals in Iraq, establishing a beachhead in the northern Kurdish enclave, Kurdistan, and securing assets in the new Iraq regime via Chalabi and others, Israeli strategic plans to extend U.S. military operations to Iran and Syria were facing major challenges from within the U.S. military and public, and even sections of the mass media. Mossad assets in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and elsewhere had to settle for puff pieces, proclaiming Iran's non-existent nuclear weapons threat, right after the same plot with regard to Iraq was exposed as a total fabrication. Another line of propaganda was needed to silence war critics and heighten animosities toward the Islamists, Arabs in general, and in Iran in particular. This is where the Fleming Rose Mossad operation came into the picture. The Islamic hate cartoons were published in Denmark in September 2005 as Israeli and U.S. Zionists escalated their war propaganda against Iran. The initial response from the Islamic countries, however, was limited. The story wasn't picked up in the International Herald Journal until late December 2005. By early January 2006, Mossad Qassas, Hebrew for case officers, activated Sayanim, volunteer Jewish collaborators outside of Israel, throughout Western and Eastern European media to simultaneously reproduce the cartoons on February 1 and 2, 2006. One such Sayan operation would have been the decision by François, senior editor Arnaud Levy, and editor-in-chief Serge Faubert to publish the cartoons. The paper's French-Egyptian Roman Catholic owner almost immediately fired the paper's managing editor, Jacques Lafranc, who, according to an interview with CNN, had initially opposed their publication without touching Levy and Faubert. A strident campaign was launched in practically all the pro-Western mass media, condemning the initial, relatively moderate Islamic protests, which had occurred between September to December 2005, and rapidly provoked the subsequent massive escalation, doubtlessly aided by covert Mossad operatives among Arab populations. Mossad's little farts, the Danish intelligence, fanned the fires by advising Denmark's right-wing Prime Minister Anders Fogh Rasmussen not to give way by refusing to apologize to the pro-Western Arab regimes requested, and even refusing a request for a meeting with a group of Denmark-based diplomats from Arab and Muslim countries to discuss the situation. Fleming Rose / Mossad tried one more gambit to further heighten East-West tension. He publicly offered to publish any Iranian cartoons which would mock the Holocaust in his paper. The senior editor of Gillen's Posten apparently belatedly caught on to Fleming Rose's hidden agenda and vetoed the offer, asking Rose to take a leave of absence. Rose left for Miami, not Tel Aviv, where his residency might raise suspicions about his claim to be merely an opponent of self-censorship. In Miami, he no doubt will have the protection of the locally based Sayanim, armed and trained for self-defense of threatened Zionists. Sayanim, defenders of Western civilization. The Sayanim, a name derived according to Victor Ostrovsky from the Hebrew word to help, are a huge worldwide network of Jews in strategic or useful places, real estate, mass media, finance, car dealerships, etc., who have agreed to help Israeli Mossad activities within their own countries. This has been ascribed to the supranational loyalty Sayanim offer to Israel, above and not always in the interest of their home country. According to Gordon Thomas and Martin Dillon in their detailed biography, Robert Maxwell, Israel's super spy, the notorious media mogul Robert Maxwell was a super Saiyan providing cover, offices, political connections, money laundering services, and planting stories in the service of Israel at Mossad's behest. The activities of these helpers range from the spectacular to the more mundane, and according to Victor Ostrovsky in his 1990 biography, by way of deception, the Sayanim represent a pool of thousands of active and inactive individuals who can provide services discreetly out of loyalty to the cause of Israel as defined by any current Mossad operation. The cynicism of this arrangement is clear. It makes little difference to the Mossad if an operation such as Fleming Rose jeopardizes the national and economic interests of the Scion's own country, and, if exposed, might harm the status of Jews in the diaspora. The standard response from the Mossad would be, so what's the worst that could happen to those Jews? They'd all come to Israel? Great. This recklessness clearly has ramifications for Jews who have refused to be recruited as Mossad helpers in affected countries. Mossad war propaganda and the cartoon controversy. Israeli leaders expressed their opposition to the Bush administration's diplomatic efforts to engage the European powers in the Iran negotiations, which delayed action against Iran. Automatically, and without question, all the major Zionist and Jewish organizations in the U.S., AIPAC, Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, ADL, and others, unleashed a sustained national campaign to mobilize Congress and their friends in the executive branch to take immediate military action or to impose economic sanctions on Iran. However, the Bush administration, while in agreement, lacked public support in the U.S. and among its European allies and their national electorates for such policy. The Mossad policy was to create a pretext to polarize public opinion between the Middle East and beyond, and the West in order to escalate tensions and demonize Islamic adversaries to its Middle East hegemonic pretensions. The Rose cartoons served the Mossad perfectly. The issue could be presented as a free speech issue, a conflict of values, not interests, between the democratic West and the fundamentalist totalitarian, as characterized by Pipes Rose, Islamists. Nothing could be further from the truth. Rose had solicited and selected the Islamic caricatures, while his paper had rejected similar cartoons of Jesus Christ in an earlier context. The image of Rose as a cultural iconoclast, while working for a right-wing daily whose daily fare was publishing anti-Mideast immigrant, quote, news stories and favorable interviews with Zionist extremists, is prima facie not credible, although that image has been purveyed by all the major media outlets. Further, while Rose may have initiated the international tensions of the efforts of his liberal and neocon colleagues and his comrades in and out of the Mossad publicizing the appearance of the caricatures were required to be able to reach and thereby provoke the ire of the Arab and Islamic world. This explains the delay between the original publication of the cartoons and the massive Muslim response that erupted months later. The cartoons, the subsequent insults and calumnies attacking the Islamic protesters and their secular allies throughout Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and Europe eventually provoked major peaceful and then violent protests by millions of people. Visual images of violent protests and demonstrations were featured by the Western mass media, successfully creating the intended fear and apprehension against Muslim countries and minorities in Europe. Islamophobia gained momentum. Zionist propagandists in Europe and the US linked the defense of free speech issue to Israeli security policies. While the West was engaged in calumniating the Islamic protesters, Israel blockaded Gaza, and the US and Europe cut off all funding to the Palestinians, threatening the population with mass starvation for exercising its democratic right to elect its own leaders. Rose's free speech charade revived the discredited ZionCon doctrine of the clash of civilizations, playing on European Islamophobia and the increasing sensitivity of practicing Muslim and Arab nationalists to Western abuses. It is likely that Israeli psych war experts pinpointed the free speech issue as the ideal detonator for the conflict. The democratic electoral victory of Hamas, dubbed by Israel as a terrorist movement, accelerated Israeli efforts to convince Western governments to insist that regimes in Muslim countries repress the irrational Islamic masses or face Western censure or elimination of aid. The failure to crack down violently on demonstrators was presented by the Western media as official approval or instigation. The major U.S. Zionist organizations were able to influence Secretary of State Rice into blaming Iran and Syria for fomenting the worldwide demonstrations from Gaza to the Philippines. The Israeli strategy was to use European outrage to weaken opposition to a military attack or economic sanctions on Iran and Syria, or preceding that on Gaza and Lebanon. Beyond religious blasphemy, while most establishment analysts have narrowly focused on the cartoon as the source and target of the massive global demonstrations, in fact, it is at best the immediate detonator of a whole series of ongoing events of much greater political significance, from the shock and awe carpet bombing of Iraq to the mass torture and routine, everyday humiliation in occupied countries, to the utter destruction of Fallujah, now a symbol of American annihilation as Guernica has been for the Nazis, to Israeli devastation of Jenin and Palestine, from the everyday assassinations of Palestinians by the Israeli occupiers to the smearing of the Quran with filth at Guantanamo. Israel, the US, and Europe have attempted to demonstrate that no Muslims are safe anywhere, not in their schools, homes, offices, fields, factories, or mosques, and that nothing they hold dear is sacred. The reason that millions were demonstrating against a caricature of Muhammad published in an insignificant Scandinavian right-wing newspaper is that this was the last straw, the detonator of a series of deliberate violations of fundamental social and political rights of Muslims, Arabs, and colonized people. While the Western media have focused exclusively on the religious content of the demonstrators, almost every country where massive sustained demonstrations have taken place has been subject to recent Western intervention, large-scale pillage of raw materials, and or experienced the destruction of their secular rights, countries invaded, homes, schools, hospitals, systems of health and clean water demolished, agriculture and natural resources looted, museums, libraries, and archaeological sites pillaged, and mosques desecrated. The West has rendered present conditions for material existence an inferno for all the peoples, both secular and observant, living in Arab or Islamic countries. Now, their most profound historic spiritual reference point, the Prophet Muhammad, the most cherished religious figure, has been repeatedly trampled with impunity by arrogant imperialists and their media servants, aided and abetted by the Israeli state and its overseas Zionism operatives. It is a gross misrepresentation to suggest that practicing Muslims could desecrate Jesus Christ with impunity, when Jesus is among the revered prophets of Islam. That too is forbidden by the Quran and would be abhorrent to the thought of Muslims. As the Israeli strategists well knew in advance, the vilification of Islam was not taking place in a political vacuum. The material conditions for an Islamic Arab uprising were ripe. Hamas had swept the Palestinian elections. The US military were aware that they were losing the war in Iraq. Iran was refusing to capitulate. Bush was losing public support for ongoing and future Middle Eastern wars. AIPAC, Israel's main political instrument for influencing U.S. policy, was under criminal investigation. Israel's strategy of having the U.S. fight its wars was boomeranging. There was a need to revive the politico-military tensions which they had exploited after September 11, 2001, to Israel's advantage. Hence, the Fleming-Rose provocation. Hence, the coordinated widespread promotion of the act. Hence, the free speech agitation among Western Zionism, liberals, conservatives, and neocon ideologues. Hence, the predictable explosion of protest. Hence, the reaction of Mideast tension and the advances of Israel's agenda. Clearly, the burgeoning confrontation portends more than simply a religious or free speech issue. more than the crude provocations of an errant cultural editor coddled by the little farts of a penetrated Danish intelligence agency. What is at stake is the deliberate racist stereotyping of Arab, Islamic, and Third World peoples in order to sustain and deepen their oppression, exploitation, and subordination, and Western willingness to accept this process despite all protections against incitement of hatred, whether enshrined or international or domestic law. The most pervasive, prolific, and influential sources of racist Arab stereotypes are Israel and its overseas, particularly US and European, academics, terror, quote, experts, and psychologists at the most prestigious universities and think tanks who have provided the psychological profile to torture, humiliation, provoke, and repress the millions struggling for self-determination against colonial and imperial dominance. Once again, Israel, and especially its overseas operatives, have placed the expansion and militarist interests of Israel above the interests of the peoples of the US and Europe. The criterion, is it good for the Jews, as defined by the Israeli state, has led to the blind alley of massive confrontations and deepening animosity between Arab Muslim peoples and Western regimes. What appeared so clever to the roses of the world and their katzas and docile Sionim in provoking confrontation may once again boomerang. The uprisings may go beyond protesting symbols of vilification to attacking the substance of power, including the Arab and Muslim proconsuls and collaborators of Euro-American political and economic power. While the Mossad is very astute in infiltrating and provoking oppressed groups, it has been singularly inept in controlling and containing the resultant uprisings, as the recent victory of Hamas demonstrates and the success of the Iraqi resistance illustrates. The next controversial cartoon may show Moses leading his people into the desert. Epilogue. While the Mossad provoked controversy between the West and the Islamic peoples, framed as free speech versus blasphemy, rather than free speech versus incitement to hatred, continues to deepen, Israel has proceeded to impose a Nazi-like economic siege over 4 million Palestinians, intended to starve them into surrendering their democratic freedoms. Intended is the concise term. Gideon Levy, columnist for the Israeli daily newspaper Haaretz, records Dov Weissglass, advisor to the Israeli prime minister, jokingly telling top officials, quote, "It's the economic blockade, which may include electricity and water as well as food. It's like an appointment with a dietitian. The Palestinians will get a lot thinner, but won't die." The Israeli officials rolled with laughter. As Levy points out, more than half of all Palestinians are already living in poverty. Last year, 37% had difficulties obtaining food. 54% of the residents of Gaza cut back the amount of food they consume. Child mortality rose by 15%. Employment reached 28%. Planned, premeditated mass starvation of a ghettoized population, jokingly discarded by its executioners as a visit to the dietitian, is an exact replica of the internal policy discussion of the Nazi high command over the population in the Warsaw Ghetto. Israel's capacity to impose and implement a genocidal policy has been greatly facilitated by the symbolic sideshow that the Mossad orchestrated in Western Europe. Cultural conflict at the service of genocide is hardly a clever ruse or merely a violation of Islamic sensibilities. It is a crime against humanity.